The story of Goliath, the Philistine giant, begins long before his birth, in an ancient and mysterious time when the scriptures mention the existence of giants on the earth. These giants were not ordinary beings. They were known as the Nephilim, a powerful and feared race, mentioned in the book of Genesis. According to the biblical account, the Nephilim arose from the union between the sons of God, interpreted as fallen angels, and the daughters of men. The result of this union was the birth of giants of incredible stature, strength, and power. These beings were described as men of renown, formidable warriors, and heroes of the past. But before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These Nephilim not only inhabited the earth but dominated it. They were such a significant presence that, in their days, people spoke of them with fear and respect. They were known not only for their colossal size but also for their violence and the way they spread destruction wherever they went. They did not follow the rules of ordinary men, and their existence seemed a dark reminder of a disordered world, where the boundaries between the divine and the human had been crossed. However, the world of the Nephilim did not last forever. When God looked upon the corruption that had spread over the earth, he decided to bring the flood. The purpose of the flood was to purify the earth from the wickedness that had spread, and the Nephilim were, for the most part, destroyed during this catastrophic event. But, surprisingly, they did not disappear completely. After the flood, the lineage of the giants continued in certain parts of the world, especially in the lands of Canaan, where Goliath and his brothers would be known. One of the most feared tribes that inhabited Canaan was the people of the Anakim, also known as the descendants of Anak, who stood out for their unusual height and strength. They were a race of giants and formidable warriors, so terrifying that when the Israelite spies, sent by Moses, went to explore the promised land, they returned with frightening reports about the sons of Anak. The spies described these giants as so great that the Israelites felt like grasshoppers before them. And it was from this lineage that Goliath, the most famous giant, and his brothers would emerge. Goliath was not an anomaly or an isolated being. He was part of an ancestral tradition of giant warriors, born for battle, prepared for combat from birth. The presence of these giants among the Philistines, one of Israel's greatest enemies, was a constant source of terror for the neighboring nations. Goliath, along with his brothers, became a symbol of invincible strength. They were considered almost indestructible warriors who spread fear and panic wherever they went. Their massive bodies, heavy armor, and enormous weapons seemed insurmountable in the eyes of ordinary men. To the Philistines, the giants were their champions. To the Israelites and other peoples, they were the worst nightmares materialized. The narrative of Goliath and his brothers is part of a larger story of giants who, over time, became living legends. These giants, descendants of the Nephilim and the Anakim, were seen as a manifestation of the raw power of the earth, of humanity's dark and rebellious past. They represented everything that ordinary men feared: disorder, chaos, and destructive force. The arrival of Goliath on the biblical scene was not merely the emergence of another Philistine warrior. It was the reintroduction of an ancient threat, of a lineage that seemed destined to challenge anyone who dared to oppose it. Goliath and his brothers carried on their shoulders the legacy of the Nephilim and the fearsome reputation of the Anakim. They were the nightmare that had survived the flood, the force that no one had been able to completely stop. Goliath, a name that echoes through the ages, was the terror of the battlefield. He was not just an ordinary man. This Philistine giant, standing nearly 3 meters tall, was a terrifying vision of strength and power. Just imagine. While the soldiers of Israel stood there, their hearts racing and legs trembling, there was Goliath on the other side of the field, towering like a living mountain. He wore a bronze armor that gleamed in the sun like polished gold. It was as if the heavens themselves reflected the glory of his invincibility. Every piece of his armor seemed to have been forged especially for him, a true mobile fortress. The bronze helmet covering his head left only his eyes exposed, and those eyes burned with an immense fury, always ready to face any adversary who dared approach. And his weapons? Well, those were not for just anyone. Goliath held a gigantic spear, so heavy it seemed impossible for an ordinary man to even lift it. The The tip of the spear was solid iron and gleamed like lightning in the sunlight. He also carried a sword far too large for any Israelite warrior and a shield that could cover an entire man. With every step he took, the sound of his armor reverberated across the battlefield, like thunder announcing the storm that was about to arrive. The daily repeated challenge. But Goliath was not just brute strength. He knew how to use his presence to spread fear. Every morning at sunrise and every evening before nightfall, Goliath would leave the Philistine camp and stand before the army of Israel. With a deep, arrogant voice, he issued his challenge, day after day, without fail, for 40 consecutive days. "Where is the warrior of Israel? Send a man to face me. If he defeats me, we will be your slaves. But if I defeat him, you will serve the Philistines," Goliath shouted, his voice echoing through the hills, making even the bravest of Israel's warriors hesitate. And that wasn't all. Goliath didn't just insult the soldiers. He also mocked the God of Israel, something that was unthinkable for any Israelite. "Where is your God now? He cannot save you from me?" the giant taunted, a cruel smile on his face, as he raised his head to the sky as if to challenge the Creator himself. The fear among the Israelites. With each insult, the hearts of the Israelites shrank even more. The men who had once faced fierce battles now found themselves paralyzed by fear. Who would dare face this invincible giant? Even their leaders were perplexed, unable to find a solution. The truth was clear. No one wanted to be the man who would face Goliath in single combat. Fear had taken hold of the Israelite camp, and Goliath knew it. During those 40 days, the atmosphere in the Israelite camp grew increasingly tense. Every morning, as the sun rose and the giant approached to repeat his challenge, the soldiers looked at the ground, avoiding each other's gaze, afraid that someone might suggest it was their turn. Each insult from Goliath was like a blow to their souls, and the despair grew, the tension in the air. And so the story unfolded. The giant Goliath, invincible in his strength, seemed unshakable. The tension was palpable, and the Israelites were on the verge of losing all hope. The fate of the people of Israel hung by a thin thread, and the giant seemed ever closer to crushing it. Yet, Goliath's story was far from over. Something unexpected was about to happen. An unlikely hero, from an unexpected place, was about to rise on the horizon and change the course of events forever. Enjoying the video? If these messages have touched your heart, how about subscribing to the channel? That way, you stay updated on all the latest news and don't miss a single word of faith and hope. On the battlefield, where fear reigned among the Israelite soldiers, a figure appeared that no one expected. A young shepherd named David. He was the youngest of his brothers and far from being a soldier. His life was simple, spent in the fields tending to his family's sheep. But David had something that set him apart from all others present. He did not carry fear in his heart, but an unwavering confidence in God. David had not come to the battlefield to fight. In fact, he was there to bring food to his brothers who were part of the Israelite army. But when he arrived, he heard Goliath's insults, the Philistine giant, and saw the terror that had overtaken his people. The young man's eyes burned with indignation. "How dare this man defy the army of the living God?" he thought. Without hesitation, David went to King Saul and did something no one expected. He offered to fight Goliath. The reaction was one of surprise and disbelief. How could a simple shepherd, with no experience in warfare, face such a feared giant? But David was determined. His strength did not come from muscles or weapons but from his unwavering faith in God. David's simple preparation. While the soldiers around him prepared with heavy armor and sharp weapons, David refused any armor offered by Saul. "I'm not used to this," he said. David knew that his true weapon was not the sword, but his trust in God. Instead of a shining armor and a heavy sword, David went down to a stream and chose 5 smooth stones, simple, yet perfect for his sling. This sling, which he had used so many times to protect his sheep from wild animals, would now be his only weapon against the giant. Every step David took toward the battlefield was accompanied by looks of astonishment and doubt. The soldiers around him could hardly believe what they were seeing. "How can a boy like him even think of facing Goliath?" was the murmur in the camp. But David did not waver. He was certain that the battle would not be won by human strength but by the power of God. The encounter with the giant. When Goliath saw David approaching, he let out a deafening laugh. He mocked the young man, who seemed to be nothing more than an unprepared boy. "Do you come at me with sticks and stones? Am I a dog?" the giant shouted, laughing in disdain. He was used to facing strong and experienced men, not unarmed shepherds. But David was undeterred. With his eyes fixed on the giant, he responded with confidence. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, he will deliver you into my hands." The tension was palpable. On one side, the invincible giant, surrounded by his armor and weapons. On the other, a young man with nothing but a sling and 5 stones. But at that moment, all those present witnessed something extraordinary. The unexpected victory. Goliath, with unbelievable calm, placed a stone in his sling and began to spin it above his head. His movements were precise, as if he were in total control of the situation. When the stone was released, it was as if time stopped for a second. The stone flew through the air, and before anyone could react, it struck Goliath squarely in the forehead. The giant, who once seemed invincible, fell to the ground with a thunderous crash, like a collapsing mountain. Silence took over the battlefield. Everyone, both the Philistines and the Israelites, were paralyzed with surprise. Goliath was dead, brought down by a simple stone. But David didn't stop there. He ran to Goliath's body, took the Philistines' giant sword, which barely fit in his hands, and decapitated the giant. This act sealed Israel's victory. The Philistines, upon seeing their champion defeated in such an unexpected way, fled in panic, while the Israelites, now full of courage, pursued them, celebrating the victory that came from an unexpected place. The lasting impact. The story of David and Goliath became one of the most well-known and powerful lessons of courage and faith. It wasn't David's strength that had defeated the giant, but his trust in God. That victory proved to all of Israel that when God is with you, no giant can prevail. Goliath wasn't the only one who carried the legacy of a giant. In fact, he was part of an entire family of colossal warriors, all imposing and feared. Goliath's name alone was enough to fill the hearts of Israel's warriors with fear, but the story didn't end with him. His brothers, also giants, loomed like threatening shadows over Israel, each with overwhelming strength and weapons that would make any common man tremble. Among them, Lami stood out. He was a vision of pure power and fury, a warrior whose name would soon be remembered in many stories, just like Goliath. Described as a giant of imposing stature, Lami was as strong as his famous brother. But what truly captured everyone's attention was his weapon, a gigantic spear. The shaft of Lami's spear was so wide and heavy that people compared it to a weaver's beam. Now, try to imagine that for a moment. A weapon so large that it didn't seem made for the hands of a man but for a creature out of legend. It was the kind of weapon that, just by looking at it, made it clear that a confrontation with him would be fatal for almost any opponent. The threat grows. Like Goliath, the giant brothers stood out in battles, emerging from the Philistine armies as unbeatable champions. Their cries echoed across the battlefields, issuing provocative challenges to the Israelites. They didn't just fight, they wanted to humiliate. Like Goliath, each of the giants believed that no warrior of Israel would dare face them. Their presence, combined with their monumental weapons, made any man think twice before accepting a duel. And so, the threat of the giants continued to grow. The Israelites had already witnessed Goliath's power and knew that his brothers would be no different. Each battle in which the giants appeared brought with it the fear that, this time, there might not be a David to face them. But, as time went on, something remarkable began to happen. One by one, Goliath's giant brothers began to fall. The fall of the giants. The Bible mentions that, just as Goliath was defeated by David, his brothers would also meet their end at the hands of brave Israelite warriors. It wasn't just physical strength that decided these battles, but courage, strategy, and above all, faith. The giants, powerful as they were at a disadvantage against those who trusted in God's power. Lami, the giant with the enormous spear, was one of the first to fall. In a fierce battle, one of the Israelite warriors rose to face him. The tension in the air was almost palpable. On one side, the giant who, with a single blow from his spear, could easily destroy any opponent, and on the other, a seemingly ordinary man, but armed with courage and faith. When the duel began, Lami's strength was immediately evident. But, with skill and unwavering confidence, the Israelite warrior managed to dodge the giant's attacks until the decisive moment. With a precise blow, Lami fell, just as his brother Goliath had fallen before him. Goliath's other brothers also met similar fates. Although each was an immense threat, the warriors of Israel, inspired by David's example, refused to surrender to fear. Each giant, no matter how feared, met their end at the hands of warriors who trusted not in their own strength but in the power of God. The legacy of the battles. These battles against Goliath's giant family became more than simple conflicts between nations. They transformed into powerful lessons of faith, courage, and determination. The giants, with all their size and power, represented the impossible challenges that, from time to time, everyone faces. But Israel's victories showed that, with faith, even the most feared giant can fall. The fall of Goliath was just the beginning. His brothers, no matter how strong and terrifying, also met their fates at the hands of men who rose with courage, driven by the certainty that God fought alongside them. Although Goliath fell to the ground with a well-aimed stone from David, his impact was far from disappearing. On that battlefield, Goliath's defeat marked a turning point for Israel. However, in the hearts and minds of the Philistines, the giant still lived. His colossal and invincible image still hovered over each of their soldiers. Goliath's name became a symbol not only of strength but of terror, a legacy that would last for generations. For the Philistines, Goliath's death was a devastating blow, but not the end of the fight. The city of Gath, where Goliath and his brothers came from, was known as the home of giants. These powerful beings, descendants of an ancient and mysterious lineage, continued to appear in the ranks of the Philistine armies, challenging and intimidating the Israelites in battle after battle. Every time Israel heard the name Gath, a chill ran down their spine, for they knew the threat of giants still lurked, ready to resurface. The shadow of the giants. Even after Goliath's fall, the people of Israel still faced a relentless enemy. The Philistines, bolstered by the fame of their fallen giant, never hesitated to use fear as a weapon. Every new confrontation between the armies brought Goliath's shadow to the minds of the Israelites, who remembered his towering stature, his monstrous weapons, and his dominating presence. The giants of Gath, like Goliath, were formidable warriors, armed with spears that seemed like tree trunks and shields that appeared to be moving walls. The story of each battle between the Israelites and the Philistines was marked by the presence of these giants. And though Goliath was dead, the simple fact that others like him still walked the earth brought an almost unbearable tension to Israel's soldiers. The battles between Israel and the Philistines were not simple confrontations for territory. They carried a symbolic weight. For the Philistines, keeping Goliath's legacy alive was a way of showing the world that their power, their strength, had not been erased. Every giant that emerged on the battlefield seemed to whisper to the Israelites, "Goliath lives." The strength and fame of the Philistines. The Philistines' reputation as a fearsome people grew not only because of their giants but also because of their determination and military skill. They were masters of metallurgy, and their weapons, often made of iron, surpassed those of the Israelites in quality and strength. They were always seeking to subdue Israel, maintaining control over strategic areas and dominating the conflicts. The Philistine armies marched with confidence, and the presence of their giants made their reputation even more terrifying. In the ranks of the Israelite soldiers, Goliath's name was whispered in fearful tones, and the mere thought of facing another giant from Gath made many warriors question their chances of survival. The memory of Goliath was like a shadow over the battlefield, even though he was no longer there. It was a symbol that, despite Israel's victories, danger was always lurking. The constant threat, The lineage of the giants of Gath did not disappear with Goliath. On the contrary, his death seemed to inflame the spirit of his brothers and other giants to continue challenging Israel. These giants were not just immense warriors in stature, but they carried with them the fury of a nation that refused to accept defeat. They continued to appear in battles, as a living reminder that the war between Israel and the Philistines was far from over. Every new giant that appeared was, in a sense, a repetition of Goliath. The Israelites didn't just see a huge and powerful figure. They saw the same threat they had faced in the past, a threat that required extraordinary faith and courage to overcome. The soldiers of Israel knew that just as David had defeated Goliath with God's help, they too would need more than mere physical strength to overcome these new giants. The strength of faith against the power of giants. The lineage of the giants of Gath was a constant reminder of the spiritual battle that Israel fought. No matter how imposing the giants were, armed to the teeth and ready to destroy, there was something stronger than their weapons, the faith of the people of Israel in God. In every battle, the true power that brought down the giants wasn't the strength of swords or spears, but the trust that God was on the side of the Israelites. And so, Goliath's legacy continued. He was still a living memory in the minds of the Israelites and an inspiration for the Philistines. But with every new confrontation, Israel learned once again that no matter the size of the enemy, victory belonged to those who placed their trust in God. The giants of Gath, no matter how threatening, were mortal. But the faith that defeated Goliath was eternal. Although Goliath was the most famous of the giants from Gath, he was not the only one to represent a threat to Israel. His brothers, equally imposing and feared, continued to fight in the ranks of the Philistines, carrying the legacy of terror that Goliath had left behind. However, the fate of these giants was sealed, and one by one, they too would meet defeat at the hands of Israel's brave warriors. The scriptures, in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 21, tell us how these giants finally fell. The battlefield was the scene of intense confrontations, and in each one, Israel faced the terrifying sight of Goliath's brothers. These giants, with their enormous stature and powerful weapons, seemed invincible to the human eye. But what they didn't count on was that they weren't fighting against just men, but against the army of God. The first battle, Sibbecai and Saph. Among the giants of Goliath's lineage was Saph, a colossal warrior who, like his brothers, stood out for his immense strength and combat skill. Saph's presence on the battlefield was enough to intimidate any army. He wielded a spear as large as a tree, and his body seemed made of pure muscle. The Philistines believed that Saph would be the next champion to defeat Israel, but they were mistaken. In David's army, there was a man named Sibbecai. He was one of the king's mighty warriors, known for his bravery and faith. When the battle against the Philistines intensified and Saph advanced, threatening to destroy all who stood in his way, Sibbecai did not hesitate. He knew that just as David had defeated Goliath, that giant too would fall. The duel between Sibbecai and Saph was intense. With each blow, the battlefield vibrated with the impact. Saph's spear cut through the air with a threatening whistle, but Sibbecai, with skill and courage, dodged the attacks. He knew he couldn't face the giant in pure strength, but his faith gave him the confidence that God was with him. At the decisive moment, Sibbecai found a breach in the giant's defense. With a precise strike, he brought Saph down. The giant, who had once seemed invincible, fell to the ground, defeated by the courage of a man who trusted not in his own strength but in the power of God. Saph's death was a great triumph for Israel, and the Philistines, seeing that yet another of their champions had fallen, began to retreat, overcome by fear. Saph was not the only one to fall. One by one, Goliath's brothers met the same fate. In every battle, David's mighty men fought with unwavering faith, knowing that God's power was with them. Though smaller in size and physical strength than the giants they faced, they carried something the giants did not: the certainty that they fought in the name of the Lord of hosts. Another giant, Ishbi-benob, also tried to challenge Israel. He was one of the last giants of Goliath's lineage and carried a spear so heavy that it seemed impossible for an ordinary man to lift. Ishbi-benob believed he would avenge the death of Goliath and his brothers. But once again, the the Philistines' plans were thwarted. In a fierce battle, Abishai, David's nephew and another mighty warrior, faced Ishbi-Benob. As in previous battles, trust in God made the difference. Abishai, with courage and skill, defeated the giant, once again proving that the strength of the Philistines was no match for Israel's warriors. With the death of Goliath and his brothers, the giants of Gath ceased to be a threat. These battles were more than military victories. They solidified Israel's power over its enemies, showing that when God was with them, not even the most feared giants could prevail. The victories of David's mighty men reinforced the people's faith and demonstrated once again that the Lord fought for Israel. These warriors were not just soldiers. They were instruments of God. Each one knew that behind their swords was a force greater than any giant. The victories of Sibbecai, Abishai, and others brought peace to Israel, sealing the definitive defeat of the giants who had once terrorized God's people. The defeat of the Philistine giants was not just a matter of strength. It was a lesson that faith in God is the most powerful weapon. Even in the face of enemies who seemed invincible, Israel's warriors rose with confidence, knowing that the battle was not theirs, but the Lord's. The story of Goliath goes beyond a simple confrontation between warriors. It carries a deep spiritual symbolism, showing that the true battle is not just physical but a struggle of faith and trust. The Philistine giant, with his heavy armor and imposing spear, represented human strength taken to the extreme, a force that, to men's eyes, seemed invincible. But victory did not lie in the strongest armor or the sharpest sword. It lay in trusting God. Goliath symbolized every challenge that seems too great to overcome. His size and strength instilled fear in his enemies. He wanted to intimidate, to make his opponents believe they had no chance. But Goliath failed to understand one essential truth. Physical strength, no matter how impressive, is never greater than faith. When David, a young shepherd with no military experience, volunteered to fight Goliath, many thought he was crazy. How could a boy without armor or sword defeat the most feared Philistine warrior? The answer lay in his faith. David didn't trust in his own strength but in the strength of God. He knew that the victory didn't depend on him but on the one guiding him. Goliath, with his confidence in human strength, never imagined that the true battle was spiritual. To him, the confrontation was merely a matter of crushing a weaker enemy. But David knew that it wasn't the sword that brought victory, but God's hand. Armed with only a sling and 5 smooth stones, David faced the giant. To any observer, it seemed like a foregone conclusion. How could a boy defeat such a powerful warrior? But David had a secret weapon, his total trust in the Lord. The story of David and Goliath isn't just about two men in combat. Each of us faces our own Goliaths. Problems that seem insurmountable, challenges that make us believe we are not strong enough. Sometimes these giants are fears, insecurities, financial difficulties, troubled relationships, or even spiritual doubts. They are obstacles that seem enormous, making us think we will never overcome them. But the message is clear. No matter how great the challenge, it will never be greater than the power of God. Like David, we don't need to be the strongest or most powerful. We don't need to have all the answers or be prepared for everything. What we need is faith. Faith that allows us to see beyond the size of the giant and recognize God's power behind us. David's act of facing Goliath with a sling and stones symbolizes something much deeper.